Picture for a moment the greatest hero France has ever known. A man who fought alongside Joan of Arc, who saved his nation from English domination, who at 25 was already Marshal of France, the highest military honor in the realm. Now, imagine that same man as the greatest monster in medieval history. This is the story of Gilles de Rais. A story that began on glorious battlefields and ended in dark torture chambers. A story that inspired one of the most terrifying legends we know. Bluebeard. Stay until the end, because you'll discover how a glorious warrior transformed into the demon that haunts our nightmares to this day. It was the year 1404 when Gilles de Montmorency-Laval was born, heir to one of the most powerful families in Brittany, destined for greatness. His lands stretched across endless horizons, castles that touched the clouds, golden fields that fed thousands, coffers overflowing with gold. At 16, Gilles was already one of the richest men in Europe. But it wasn't just wealth that defined him. When France bled under English rule, when nobles bowed in defeat, a peasant girl emerged claiming to hear divine voices. Joan of Arc arrived at court with impossible promises of liberation. And among the few who believed in her, among the few willing to follow a 17-year-old girl to hell if necessary, was Gilles de Rais. What happened next would change the course of history. At Orleans, when English cannons shattered French walls, there was Gilles in his golden armor, fighting like a lion beside the Maid. At Jargeau, when victory seemed impossible, it was Gilles who led the charge that broke enemy lines. At Patay, when 2,000 Englishmen fell in a single battle, it was Gilles de Rais who planted the French banner over their bodies. King Charles VII had no choice. At 25, an age when other nobles were still playing at war, Gilles de Rais was named Marshal of France. The youngest in history. The perfect knight of Christendom. In European courts, his name was whispered with reverence. In taverns, bards sang of his deeds. In churches, priests blessed him as an instrument of God. Gilles de Rais had become immortal. But not all types of immortality are desirable. May 30th, 1431. The flames that consumed Joan of Arc in the marketplace of Rouen didn't just burn flesh and bone. They incinerated something deep within the soul of the man who had followed her to the gates of glory. If you want to understand how Joan of Arc changed not just France, but the destiny of everyone around her, watch my video dedicated to her, the link is right here. Gilles watched from afar. Not physically, he was on his lands when the news arrived, but spiritually. He was there, watching his faith turn to ashes along with the body of the young woman he considered a saint. And it was in that moment that something died in Gilles de Rais. Something that would never return. The months that followed revealed a different man. Where once stood the Marshal of France, now there was an obsessed, desperate man. Gilles began spending fortunes, not on war horses or armor, but on something far stranger. Theatrical plays. Elaborate representations of Joan of Arc's life. As if, somehow, he could bring her back through theater, through art, through the obsessive repetition of her story. His properties began bleeding gold. Castles were sold, lands mortgaged. Gilles' family begged for moderation, but he listened to no one. There was something he needed to find, something that only the impossible could give him. And so it was that Gilles de Rais took his first step toward the darkness. The castle of Tiffauges had always been imposing, but now there was something different about its towers. Where once echoed laughter from banquets and troubadour songs, now hung a heavy, almost tangible silence. Gilles had withdrawn from the world. He no longer appeared at court, no longer led armies. Instead, he began receiving very peculiar visitors at his properties. Men who whispered about ancient sciences, about forbidden knowledge, about ways to transform common metal into pure gold. Alchemy had become his obsession. If he couldn't recover Joan through theater, perhaps he could at least recover his fortune through transmutation. Couldn't he somehow undo the terrible mistake of her death? The laboratories Gilles built at Tiffauges were like nothing ever seen in France. Furnaces that burned day and night, strange instruments imported from distant lands, libraries filled with texts in Latin, Arabic, and languages no one else could decipher. And it was on one of those nights of frustrated experiments, when once again lead and gold remained just a dream, that Francesco Prelati knocked at the castle gates. Prelati was an Italian cleric. Young, eloquent, with eyes that seemed to hold ancient secrets. He claimed to know methods that other alchemists had never dreamed of. He promised not just gold, but true power, the kind of power that could bend reality itself to the will of whoever possessed it. Gilles, desperate and increasingly isolated from reality, saw in Prelati not just a new alchemist, but perhaps a savior, someone who could finally give him the answers he sought. The first weeks with Prelati seemed promising. New experiments, new formulas, new hope. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, Prelati's methods began to change. What Gilles didn't realize was that by opening his castle doors to Prelati, he was also opening the doors to something much darker. Something that would forever transform the hero of France into the monster that still haunts our legends today. In the highest towers of Tiffauges Castle, far from the eyes of servants, far from the eyes of God, Francesco Prelati began to reveal his true methods. Traditional alchemy is limited, he whispered to Gilles on moonless nights. But there are other forces in the universe. Older forces, more powerful. Forces that can give us not just gold, but everything we desire. And so it was that Gilles de Rais was introduced to what court records would later call diabolic arts. The first ceremonies were simple. Circles drawn on the floor with chalk, candles arranged in specific patterns, Latin words that Prelati insisted were just advanced scientific formulas. But gradually, the rituals became more complex, more sinister. The chalk was replaced by darker substances. The Latin words gave way to invocations in languages that made the castle dogs howl in terror. And the entities Prelati claimed to be contacting gained names: Baron, Orient, Beelzebub. According to trial documents that would come years later, Prelati convinced Gilles that these entities could give him anything: infinite gold, power over life and death, even the ability to bring Joan of Arc back from the dead. All they needed was to prove their dedication. All they needed was to offer something in return. At first, the offerings were simple. Animals, precious objects, promises of eternal loyalty. But the entities, according to Prelati, wanted more. They always wanted more. The historical record leaves no room for doubt about what happened next, but even after centuries, even knowing we're dealing with documented facts, it's hard to fathom how a man could descend so deeply into the abyss of human depravity. The year was 1432 when the first disappearances began. At first, they were just rumors. A child who left home to gather firewood and never returned. A young shepherd who simply vanished among the hills. Poor families in the region began whispering about a curse, about something terrible stalking the lands of Marshal Gilles de Rais. But the truth was far worse than any curse. Gilles' servants, those who would testify in courts years later, reported a terrible pattern. Men in service to the castle would approach peasant families in distress. They offered opportunities for their children, work at the castle, education, a chance to escape the poverty that condemned them to lives of misery. For desperate parents, it was a blessing from heaven. The great hero of France, offering opportunity to their children? How could they refuse? The children were taken to Tiffauges with promises of feasts and fine clothes. And indeed, according to testimonies, they were initially well treated. Fed, dressed in noble garments, treated like little princes and princesses. But this kindness had a dark purpose. Francesco Prelati had convinced Gilles that the entities they invoked demanded a very specific type of offering. Something pure, something innocent. And the greater the suffering offered, the greater the power granted in return. What happened in the towers of Tiffauges in the nights that followed is something court records documented with details that still make historians shudder today. Rituals that combined Prelati's occult practices with Gilles' thirst for absolute power. Between 1432 and 1440, it's estimated that between 80 and 200 children disappeared in Gilles de Rais lands. Some estimates speak of even higher numbers. Each one lured by the same promises, each one taken to the same macabre rituals. The servants who testified at the trial spoke of screams echoing through the towers during the night, of strange odors emanating from Gilles' laboratories, of human ashes being dumped in the castle moats at dawn. And through all of this, Gilles de Rais, the man who had once saved France, remained convinced he was doing something necessary, something that would eventually give him the power to fix all the world's wrongs, including Joan of Arc's death. But it was already too late. The monster he had become had left a trail of horror that could not be erased. And the world was beginning to notice. September 1440. The castle of Tiffauges, which for years had been a place of unspeakable horrors, was finally surrounded by the men of Duke John V of Brittany. The investigations had begun when a local priest disappeared after confronting Gilles about the rumors circulating through the region. It was one thing to make peasant children disappear, unfortunately, that rarely caused waves in noble circles. But making a man of the church disappear? That was something completely different. When the Duke's soldiers invaded Tiffauges, they found evidence that exceeded even their worst expectations. Human ashes, torture instruments, black magic books written in blood. And in an isolated tower, Francesco Prelati, still drawing magic circles on the floor, still invoking entities that would never come. Gilles de Rais was arrested without resistance. The man who had once led entire armies seemed almost relieved when chains were placed on his wrists. The trials that followed were extraordinary even by the standards of the time. 2 simultaneous proceedings, one civil, for crimes against children, conducted by the Duke of Brittany, and another ecclesiastical, for heresy and diabolic invocation, conducted by the Catholic Church. In a public confession that lasted hours, Gilles de Rais admitted everything. Every crime, every ritual, every death. But he didn't just confess, he begged for forgiveness. He wept like a child, declared deep repentance, pleaded with the church to intercede for his damned soul. On October 26, 1440, Gilles de Rais was taken to a gallows built especially for him. His last words were a prayer, asking forgiveness from God and the families of his victims. First the hanging, to ensure he was dead. Then the pyre, to purify the mortal remains of the man who had become the very incarnation of evil. But even with Gilles dead, even with justice finally served, his story was far from over. Because some monsters are too big to simply die. Some monsters live forever in the stories we tell in the dark. In the years that followed, troubadours began singing ballads about the fallen marshal. Not the heroic songs of before, but dark stories about a nobleman who sold his soul to the devil. Stories that traveled from village to village, growing and transforming with each retelling. In 1697, almost 2.5 centuries after Gilles' death, a French writer named Charles Perrault published a collection of fairy tales. Among them was a story about a wealthy nobleman who married repeatedly, but whose wives had a habit of mysteriously disappearing. A story about a man with a dark blue beard in a forbidden room where he kept the bodies of his victims. Bluebeard was born. And with him, one of the most enduring archetypes in horror literature, the aristocratic predator, the monster who hides behind noble titles and wealth, using his power to satisfy unimaginable appetites. And this forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. If Gilles de Rais could fall so deeply, what does that say about the rest of us? Where is the line that separates heroism from monstrosity? And most frightening of all, can this line be crossed by anyone under the right circumstances? Perhaps it's impossible to answer these questions definitively. Because in the end, Gilles de Rais teaches us that there are no ready-made monsters. There are only people who make monstrous choices. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying lesson of all. Now tell me, do you believe Gilles de Rais really made a pact with the devil? Or do you think he was just a man destroyed by trauma and loss, who found in violence a twisted way to deal with his pain? Leave your theories in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. And remember, history is full of dark secrets waiting to be revealed. See you on the next journey. Bye.